Welcome back. This is part two with Richard Wolff. He's Professor Emeritus in Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and currently a visiting professor of the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University, New York. His latest book is Capitalism's Crisis Deepens. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you very much.
So, Richard, one part of the economic legacy that Obama leaves behind is the whole discussion and the effort to implement the DoddFrank Act. And if you speak to him or listen to the campaign speeches he did for Hillary Clinton, he takes a lot of credit for reining in and regulating Wall Street. By this, I think he means the Dodd-Frank Act. So give us a sense of your response to this financial regulation, the act. Is it effective, or was it a dismal failure here?
Well, I think it lies somewhere in between those two, let's call them extremes for the moment. But I think it has to be set in context. There used to be in the old cowboy movies that I grew up with a scene in which a corrupt sheriff of a town, confronted by his failure to prevent one or another criminal outrage, looks into the camera of the movie taker and says, "I'm busy dealing with it, let's round up the usual suspects." And the whole point of that little vignette is to show that he's not really serious, he's going to go through the motions, because every time an outrage happens, the people in authority have to at least look like they're doing something, like they're concerned, like they're going to fix the problem. Dodd-Frank was the effort by the government, led by Mr. Obama, to step in after the second worst collapse of capitalism in modern history, the worst being the one of the 1930s, but here we are with the second worst one, to step in and to do something that looks like what? That you're doing the necessary thing to promise that this kind of crisis will not happen again. And that's what Dodd-Frank was, a bill that had all kinds of rules and regulations whose purpose, whose justification was, we will not thereby have this happen to us again, a meltdown of our economy. To put it in context, let's remember that after the Great Depression, 1929 to 41, very similar reforms were enacted. They weren't called Dodd-Frank because they had different congressmen and women back then whose names were different, and so the laws have different names, like Glass-Steagall and so on. But the effort was very similar. Rein in the banks so they don't do the irresponsible investments that bring the thing to pass. Rein in the lending by all kinds of agencies. Rein in the palpable corruption that is everywhere buried in these hustles on the stock market and in finance. Dodd-Frank does it again. But you have to this time be skeptical, because if you're not skeptical, you haven't been paying attention. Everything that was done after the 1930s crash was rationalized and justified with the exact same arguments. These steps, we were told back then, are the necessary ways to make sure that this kind of collapse never confronts our children. Well, it didn't work, did it? Because in 2008, we had another major collapse in which many of the same irresponsible, unethical, and often corrupt activities were at the root of it all again. And so it's necessary to be skeptical to understand that what happened back then in a similar circumstance could very well be happening now. And indeed, my judgment, and I'm far from alone in this, is to see Dodd-Frank as too little and too late. Does it have some effects? Of course. Does it make some things more difficult to do than others? But the financial community, driven by the profit that drives all capitalist enterprises, has shown itself over and over again determined and capable to get around the laws and regulations it doesn't like, to use its political muscle to weaken the rules and regulations it doesn't like, and when it is strong enough to simply repeal them. That's what happened to the Glass-Steagall Act after the Great Depression hit. This act that prevented banks from using depositors' money for risky investments. At first, for a decade or two, the banks evaded it, got around it. Then they went to work to weaken it. And by the 1990s, they were strong enough to get it repealed. By the way, a repeal signed by Bill Clinton as president. And literally 8 or 9 years later, the financial system collapses again, with many of the banks leading the way with the inappropriate investments where they made the mistake of taking too much risk and not covering themselves in doing so. So yes, I think Dodd-Frank is a little bit like the sheriff who says, round up the usual suspects. There's a lot of theater. There's a lot of bankers saying, don't do this. There's a lot of well-meaning congressmen and women saying, we will persevere. But the end result is a grab bag of a few good things, a few bad things, and lots of fake things. And the reason there is to believe that unlike every previous effort to deal with this problem, this one is going to succeed, I don't see any evidence for it. One last way to put it. For 300 years, capitalism has been the dominant or the emerging economic system. Every 4 to 7 years, wherever capitalism settles in, there's an economic downturn, a crisis of some sort. Sometimes it's short and shallow, other times it's long and deep. The one we're in now, long and deep. But here's the reality. For the 300 years, every conceivable leader, kings, princes, presidents, prime ministers, have tried to stop this system from having this built-in instability. Every leader promised that the measures he took to get us out of whatever the latest downturn was would not only do that, but prevent us from having another one in the future. None of them ever delivered on that promise. None of them succeeded. This is a system whose inherent instability is part of it, and that's why it resists Dodd-Frank or any other effort. The solution to the instability of capitalism is not another set of rules and regulations like Dodd-Frank. We've been there, we've done that. System change is the way to solve this problem, and only when we begin to face that as a nation will we be on the road to get out from under the irrationality of these periodic collapses.
Right. And Richard, if I may look ahead a little bit into the Trump presidency coming up, the Republicans are already ready to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, which could leave almost 30 million people without health insurance. Economic think tanks such as CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, have said that the Affordable Health Care Act would and has allowed people to voluntarily go into self-employment and work on their own. What do you make of what will happen when they actually repeal the Health Care Act?
Well, let me be an economist in the narrow sense and answer your question this way. The remarkable thing about Obama's Health Care Act, for me as an economist, was that he made a significant portion of the cost of it, of increasing the number of Americans that were covered by health insurance, and thereby overcoming the scandal that we are one of the richest countries on earth and have, among industrial countries, one of the worst records in providing health insurance for our people. He made an effort in that area. He gets some credit. And he gets more credit for having made a good part of the cost of this fall on those most able to pay, the richest amongst us, in the way that the tax to pay for it was set up. And therein lies the effort to undo it. This is not a struggle coming from the Republican Party about health care, about how you manage it or how you organize it. Sure, there were mistakes made. Every new government program has mistakes in it. And guess what? Every new private program of private corporations is full of mistakes. I could remind you of the great effort of a Ford Motor Company to create the new car model, the Edsel, and what a disaster it was, or the new kinds of Coca-Cola that flopped. So mistakes are made everywhere. We're not repealing Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act because there were mistakes or because there were problems. It is being repealed by the Republicans for the same reason, and by conservative Democrats too, that all these efforts are repealed. The rich don't want to pay. And getting rid of Obamacare will remove the tax that is particularly onerous for them. And that's why they're there. These are the people who want not to pay the tax and whose health care will not be affected because they don't rely on this kind of a program in the first place. That's the injustice. That's the moral turpitude that lies behind this effort, which is all about health care in the public. But the reality behind that is this is an effort to reduce the tax burden of those at the top of our society. And that really is what ought to be exposed much more systematically than the conversation about this normally does.
All right, Richard, let's move on to the Federal Reserve. A recent memo was leaked that meetings that were held recently, they're talking about increasing the interest rates. Now, one thing one could attribute to President Obama, too, that he didn't raise the interest rates too much, actually, under his presidency, at least SEC didn't. And this was supposed to help trickle down, as you say, and create more employment and jobs and get the economy going. First, did it actually do that? And then what can we expect under the Trump presidency when it comes to the SEC?
Well, the Federal Reserve and the SEC, these agencies, basically are assigned the task, particularly with the Federal Reserve, of managing the money system and to do it in terms of improving the economic reality. Through most of Mr. Obama's term, perhaps really all of it, the problem in this society was too much unemployment, too much of a depressed economy, too much difficulty for the mass of working people. And the normal response to that is to lower interest rates, to make it easier for individuals to borrow so they can spend money and get people jobs, and for businesses to borrow so that they can invest and provide people with jobs. So you drop the interest rates. Because it was one of the worst downturns we've ever had, the interest rates came virtually down to zero to match the seriousness of the problem. The difficulty is when you have interest rates very low in a private capitalist economy, you're kind of encouraging companies to borrow money at a low interest rate that they might not otherwise have done and to make risky investments with it. That has happened. Ditto, human beings borrow when their situations are difficult and interest rates are low, and they may borrow more than they can carry as a debt in their lives. So there's always a danger that lowering the interest rate to help the situation can, given the way capitalism works, inadvertently make the situation worse. The people who see that prospect therefore want the interest rates to come up. But there's the same dialectic, the same opposites working together. You raise interest rates, you reduce risky borrowing, but you also make it more difficult for businesses and individuals to borrow and spend money, and with less money borrowed and spent, there'll be fewer jobs making the goods and services which people are not buying because they're not borrowing because the interest rates are high. You're stuck, in other words. We live in a system that pressures you to lower the interest rates, then you discover that can have unfortunate consequences, then you boomerang and raise the interest rates, and then you discover, oh my goodness, that has negative consequences. A rational person watching this boomerang behave and shaking up our economy should ask the question, maybe the system is the problem, that rather than struggling between one or another ineffective, contradictory policy, we ought to change the system so we're not trapped in that kind of either or. And the story I use to summarize it is this. If you're walking down the street and you're on your way to a meeting and someone accosts you and says, "Dear sir, I'm going to give you freedom of choice. I can either stab you or shoot you, but it's your choice." If you sat there scratching your head trying to figure out which choice to make, you would be insane, because the proper response to that set of options is, "I'm not accepting that set of options. I am not entering into a conversation about how I am to be killed." We ought to be reacting to an economic system that confronts us with this up and down bouncing interest rate by saying, we don't want to be in a system that forces us to choose between policies, both of which have effects that are not good for us.
So, Richard, policies that could benefit working people, like higher minimum wage, full employment, universal health care, and guaranteed income, look further and further away under a Trump presidency, especially given his appointees, Andy Puzder, a fast food CEO who opposes the minimum wage. He's Trump's pick for labor secretary, of all things. So what can we as workers expect under Trump presidency?
Well, I think Mr. Trump has gathered around himself a collection of people that are really remarkable. These are the people who sit at the top of our society, the richest people. I believe it's the richest cabinet proposals any president has ever gotten together. They sit at the top of the heap, and they indulge themselves in the arrogance that often goes with that, namely to imagine that they know best what should be done for everybody, and that whatever they do to feather their own nest, to make their own profits, to become even more wealthy, will in some magical way never quite spelled out, spill out, here we get trickle down again, and be the best for everybody. So everyone should shut up and let them do what they want. The fact that they've been doing that for most of their adult lives, and that the economy we're living in is a mess because of it, never deters them. They have that ready-made answer that comes from right-wing Republicans always. If there's a problem, deny it. If the problem persists and you can't deny it, blame it on the government. But you, the business community that actually pulls the strings of this economy, you are never at fault. The system that puts you at the top is never to be questioned. We're only to find some scapegoat, whether it's bad government policy or Mexicans or terrorists or anything else you can think of. Russian hackers, let's say, they're the problem, because you must keep away from public discussion an economic system that may not be working anymore and that needs to be replaced. And I think therein lies the conundrum, that Mr. Trump's cabinet will be more of business as usual, run by the people who sit at the top of this system, who produced the crash of the 1930s, who produced the crash of 2008, and to put them in charge is to willfully think that there is no reason to look elsewhere for leadership, despite the dissatisfaction of the overwhelming majority of Americans with what this leadership has done for us over the last 30 to 40 years.
All right, Richard, I thank you so much for your most insightful and well said analysis. I thank you. It makes it easily understood, and not too many economists I know can do that. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. And let me just add, I always thought that a teacher, which is what I've been all my life, that the job of a teacher is to make it accessible and understandable. And so an economist who doesn't do that, whatever else he or she is, teaching is not what they're doing. But in any case, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
You're most welcome. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.